Hey everyone, welcome to the Good Arguments podcast, where we tackle all the hardest questions about Christianity, theology, and the Bible. My guest today will be none other than Dr. Bart Ehrman, well-known author, podcaster, and professor of New Testament studies. Bart Ehrman is an agnostic in that he doesn't know for sure that God doesn't exist, but he's also an atheist in that he doesn't believe that God exists. That's the way he describes himself. And yet, Bart does respect Jesus' teachings and he tries to follow them for what that's worth. But if you're familiar with Bart, you'll know that he's best known for pointing out so-called contradictions in the Bible. He wrote a book called Jesus Interrupted, which focused on apparent contradictions in the Bible. And his most well-known book, Misquoting Jesus, goes into this as well. So Bible contradictions are his jam. Now, Bart Ehrman recently retired from his professorship at UNC and gave his final address or lecture or speech, whatever you want to call it, to a bunch of people. I'm not really sure who they are. Maybe alumni, friends, colleagues, fans. I'm not really sure. And he titled this lecture, The Most Significant Discovery in the History of Biblical Studies. So pretty cool title. And of course, he eventually gets into the subject of contradictions in the Bible. So let me start by saying this. It's extremely important that whether you're a believer or unbeliever, we all need to understand this subject of contradictions. And here's why. People often assume that if the Bible has contradictions or mistakes of any kind, that it can't be trusted, that it must not have been written by a perfect God, and that it's not worth believing in. That's the assumption. And Christians often agree with this assumption. They double down and say the Bible has zero contradictions and zero mistakes, and so we can fully trust that everything it says is true. So there's a big problem with this, but we'll get into it as we go on. So the first clip we'll listen to helps set the stage for the rest of the lecture. So let's listen.
2 weeks after I moved here, I got a phone call from somebody, from a reporter at the Raleigh News and Observer, who wanted to ask me a question. This is August 1988, and he wanted to know, is it true that Jesus is coming back next month? So there was a book that was in wide circulation, 2 million copies of this book in circulation called 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Occur in 1988. And it was widely read, especially in the South. And this fellow, he was a rocket engineer for NASA, so he was a smart guy. He was a fundamentalist Christian, and he had 88 biblical and common sense arguments that Jesus is coming back during Rosh Hashanah 1988, and and people took him seriously. I had a student in my class that semester whose parents literally sold the farm. It's one reason why religious education is so important, because many people who subscribe to particular religious views are not well educated in them. And so we provide that here.
All right, so I totally agree with Bart that this is a gut-wrenching story, which illustrates the problem. The problem is that most people, even ones that are extremely intelligent, are uneducated in biblical studies. You could have attended church your entire life and still be wildly uneducated about how to interpret the Bible. You could have 300 verses memorized. You can recite all of Jesus' parables. You know the Psalms, the Proverbs. You know the creation story back to front. You've read dozens of books on Christianity like The Purpose-Driven Life. And still, you might not know the first thing about biblical interpretation. Truly. Now you might say, how is that possible? Well, it's because when our pastors went to seminary, they learned all the tools of biblical interpretation. But when they began working as a pastor, they realized that the job was incredibly difficult. They needed to prepare a sermon each week filled with engaging illustrations and life application. They needed to counsel their struggling members and newcomers. They needed to visit the sick and the poor. They needed to reserve time for their families and so much more. That they realized teaching people about how to study the Bible needed to go way down on the priority list. That's what often happens. So then you get people like Edgar C. Whisenant, a literal rocket scientist, who writes a book predicting Jesus' return, and the entire project is completely misconceived. If Whisenant had been taught basic tools of interpretation, he would never have even considered writing such a ridiculous book because he would have known that it's impossible to predict such a thing as Christ's bodily return. All right, let's go to the next clip.
Somebody's taking New Testament in the South, who grew up in schools in the South and in churches in the South and families in the South, and you come in, they realize that there are problems with the New Testament. They've got to deal with it. And so the point is never to convert somebody or to deconvert somebody or to make them change their mind or make them drop their religion or make them believe what you believe. It's not that at all. It's to get them to think. And if they've got some reason for what they think, that's great. Okay. But if you don't have any reason for what you think, that's a problem.
Okay, so I appreciate Bart's sentiment here. He's saying that when students come and take post-secondary biblical studies with him, he's not trying to deconvert them. That's what he says, so I'll have to take him at his word. I've never taken a class with him before, but somehow I suspect that many students have deconverted after taking his classes. But anyway, he says that's not his goal. His goal is to teach kids how to think. And I think that's an extremely noble and valuable skill. I mean, he shouldn't even have to say that, right? Isn't the point of all education to teach people how to think? Not just teaching facts, but teaching students how to think, to discern, to use the powers of reason. So if this is what Bart is committed to, I applaud him for it and celebrate his legacy that hopefully he's left with all of his students. But like I said, I suspect many have missed this and have jumped straight to saying, oh, the Bible has contradictions, so I'm done with Christianity, which is a travesty. All right, next clip.
Well, okay, so today we have more than 100 manuscripts. Today, we know of over 5,800 manuscripts. How many variants do we know about? We know so... How many do we know about? We don't know how many we know about. My teacher at Princeton Theological Seminary, Bruce Metzger, used to say, we have more variants in our manuscripts than we have words in the New Testament. And the recent estimates are around 500,000 differences. Having said that, most of these differences simply show that ancient scribes could spell no better than students can today. You misspell a word, it's a difference. So most of them don't matter, but some of them matter a lot. Some of them actually change what a verse means, or what a chapter means, or what a book means. Sometimes they change the theology of the whole thing. It's, that really does matter.
All right, so this is what I'm talking about. It's statements like these that plant large seeds of doubt within young believers. When students hear Bart say that some scribal differences completely change the whole theology of a person or a passage or book, obviously that will undermine the inspiration of the scriptures. Obviously, students will doubt the reliability of the Bible. You got to track with Bart's rhetoric. He quotes Bruce Metzger, which is a huge name drop, by the way, and Metzger's quote is clearly intended as a bombshell moment, right? You can hear the gasp in the room as all the air just gets sucked out. 500,000 differences, wow. And then he says, yeah, and most of these aren't a big deal, kind of quickly and flippantly. But then again, he raises his voice and starts swinging his arms and says, but some of these are a huge deal. Do you see what I'm saying? His locution reveals what he really wants people to take away. And that is that the Bible has been changed over the years, depending on which variant was chosen, over others. Bart wants us to believe that what we have in our hands is not fully inspired by God, but is mostly the product of human ingenuity. So he's talked about the many scribal variants in Scripture, and then he says this.
But That's not the most significant discovery in the history of biblical scholarship.
All right, so as you can hear, he's getting a lot of laughs, and it shows that his audience is really eating up his stuff, right? He's going to list several key discoveries, so to speak, of biblical studies, and would you believe they all just happen to undermine the inspiration of Scripture? And so his rhetorical strategy is to pile on the evidence until the uneducated layman is bludgeoned into submission. Okay, so before we go on to his next point, I found a PDF online of one of Bart Ehrman's syllabi on his course called The Historical Jesus. This was one of the classes he taught at UNC for many years. And in the front matter, the course scope, as it's called, he summarizes what they'll cover in the course. And I like to read one line from it, but I'll post a link to the entire thing. So it says this: after reviewing the available sources, we will examine the criteria that scholars have devised for getting behind the stories told about Jesus to ascertain what he was really like. Now, I want you to ask yourself this. If you're a student and you read that line right off the bat, you haven't even taken the course yet, you haven't heard any arguments yet, but you read that, he's basically insinuating once you've taken this course, you'll know who the real Jesus was, what he actually said, and what he was actually all about. Do you see how built into this line is the idea you don't know who the real Jesus was? You thought you did, but you don't. So buckle up. That's essentially what Bart is saying. And look, if he were here with me right now, I don't think he would deny how I just characterized his words. I think he stated it as much over and over. So even though Bart claims to have no agenda towards deconverting students, I really question whether this is true. All right, he moves to archaeology. Let's listen.
But over time, archaeologists developed more rigorous methods of engaging in their work, and they dug more carefully and more systematically and started looking more critically, not to verify the biblical accounts, not to invalidate them either way. They just wanted to see what happened based on the archaeological evidence, and it wasn't good for those who are interested in verifying the Bible, because, as it turns out, there is not a single piece of archaeological evidence that there was an Exodus. Period. You know, you ain't going to find any chariots at the bottom of the Red Sea. They ain't there. There 2.5 to 3 million people wandering around in the wilderness. There's not a single potsherd that's been found. And people have looked.
All right, so Bart is extremely confident and boisterous about the lack of evidence concerning the Exodus. Now, he does qualify this, saying that some form of journey could have happened, just not in the way that the Bible describes it, but the effect is the same. He's trying to undermine our trust in the Scriptures. Now, I don't want to spend too much time refuting this point, but I do want to highlight a few misleading statements Bart made here. First, he says, you ain't going to find any chariots at the bottom of the Red Sea. Well, first of all, it's an almost certainty that the modern-day Red Sea is not the same as the biblical Red Sea. In fact, Red Sea is probably not the best translation of where the Hebrews crossed. It's more likely they crossed at something called the Sea of Reeds. And Bart Ehrman knows this, but again, he doesn't care that his audience won't know the difference. But more importantly, we're talking about wooden and leather materials from 3,400 years ago. We absolutely should not expect to find any remnants of that event. This is not like the catastrophe that took out the dinosaurs where, creatures and plants would have been buried quickly and fossilized. This is a local event, probably during a storm, and it's likely that not all the Egyptian chariots went into the sea after them. Exodus 14:28 says, "The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen of all the host of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained." So only those that followed them into the sea were destroyed. It could have been 600 chariots, 100 chariots, or 10 chariots. We don't know. But we do know that the destroyed chariot parts would have floated, most likely, and would have been scavenged. And look, let's say we did find the right location of the Sea of Reeds crossing, and we did find a wheel. do you think the hard-nosed skeptics would accept it? You see, when you've spent your whole career denying the historicity of something, it makes it really tough to be fair when evidence is presented to you. Now, the second misleading statement Bart made was 2.5 to 3 million people wandering around in the wilderness. Alright, so this whole wandering around in the wilderness is a popular phrase you hear Christians say, but there are two views on this. Deuteronomy 2:14 says, "And the time from our leaving Kadesh Barnea until we crossed the brook Zered was 38 years. So either they got to Kadesh early on in their journey, wandered around the wilderness for 30 plus years, then came back to Kadesh at the end before entering the promised land, or they stayed at Kadesh most of the time as their home base." So this second view is way more plausible because the Arabian Peninsula is arid and water is extremely scarce. So it makes the most sense that they camped there for the bulk of the 38 years. But again, should we expect to find remains there 3,400 years later? Maybe, and maybe we will. So I encourage Bart to be a little more humble about what we might find or don't find. Alright, so again, he says that archaeological findings, or lack thereof, are also not the most significant discovery of the history of biblical studies. So then he moves on to the Dead Sea Scrolls, and for the sake of time, I've patched several clips together so that we hear only the most important stuff. So let's listen.
But then a hugely significant discovery was made in 1947. In 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. They were discovered by accident, but when they were discovered, it was quite significant. They were discovered in a community, near a community that's now called Qumran, spelled with a Q, Qumran, which is, it's to the sort of northwest area of northwest of the Dead Sea. They started exploring caves. They ended up finding 11 caves that had scrolls in them. Some of them were fairly complete scrolls. I mean, the Isaiah scroll is magnificent. It's a copy of Isaiah that is 1,000 years earlier than the copy we were relying on up till then. 1,000 years earlier. So people were copying Jewish manuscripts, so we did Christian manuscripts, but we didn't have the intervening manuscripts. Right? We had this thing from the year 1000, and now all of a sudden, whoa, we got this thing from Isaiah. So every book of the Hebrew Bible was discovered, at least a fragment of the book, or the whole thing, was discovered, except for the book of Esther, as it turns out. We have a description of a war that was soon going to take place. It was going to be the war to end all wars. The apocalyptic end of time was going to come, and we have a scroll that describes it. These scrolls are just absolutely fantastic for enlightening us about one aspect of Judaism that we had very little knowledge of before. And so hugely important, but also for the relevance for understanding Jesus. Because these scrolls embody a worldview about the coming judgment of God against this world that's going to happen very soon to destroy all those who are opposed to God and bring in a good world that God had planned from the beginning. It's very much like the teachings of Jesus. At the same time, in roughly the same area. It's not that Jesus belonged to this community, but it set the context within which to put Jesus' proclamation. Hugely significant. But not the most significant discovery.
Okay, so Bart praises the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, as he should, because it was absolutely an out-of-this-world discovery. And it begs the question, if something like that can be found, something that no one knew existed and discovered by accident, what else might be lurking just underneath the surface? Shouldn't this type of discovery make us really humble regarding what we might find in the future? Right, so Bart praises the Dead Sea Scrolls and particularly the Isaiah scroll, right? But he fails to mention what's so significant about this discovery. He says the Dead Sea Isaiah scroll dated to 1,000 years prior to the other manuscripts they had, but he doesn't mention that the scrolls were basically the same, that they showed virtually no differences worth writing home about, no theological development whatsoever. Why didn't he tell his audience this? This was the most amazing discovery that almost every anthropologist would have expected. In fact, Bart Ehrman wrote a book himself called How Jesus Became God, and in it he argues that Jesus never claimed to be God, but the apostles changed Jesus' words and added a bunch of stuff to make it sound like Jesus did claim to be God. And that's why Christians believe it, even though it's not true. So Bart is very fond of this idea that over time, even a few decades, texts can change and develop, and that's what happens. So it should absolutely blow his pants off that Isaiah and many of the other biblical texts weren't actually changed over hundreds and hundreds of years. Funny how he failed to mention that, eh? But he did find time to mention that the Qumran community and Jesus both agreed that an apocalyptic war was coming soon that would usher in the kingdom of God. But of course, Bart's implication is that it never happened. So the Qumran community and Jesus were both wrong. That's what he was saying. So again, at every opportunity, Bart says we can't trust the Bible. Now, I believe there was a war in the first century, and it was a horrific and earth-shattering war, the Roman-Jewish War, and it ended the Old Covenant system and ushered in the New Covenant system for the church, the Israel of God. But I guess Bart didn't feel like mentioning that as a possibility for what Jesus or Qumran were talking about.
The single most discovery I'm now going to tell you, but I'm going to tell you first, it's going to seem rather banal. Minor, uninteresting, not exactly headline news, but it revolutionized the field. And it forever changed our understanding of the Jewish and Christian scriptures. It is that the Bible's not a single book. The most important discovery, I'm going to argue, is this.
All right, the Bible is not one single book. Well, obviously, it's 66 books. Everyone knows this. So what's going on here? What kind of game is Bart playing? Well, I have a theory. I think he's trying to quash the discipline of biblical theology. Now, let me explain. Biblical theology isn't just the study of the Bible. No, it's a technical term for a specific discipline within biblical studies. Biblical theology is in fact the study of how the Bible tells one story. The scholarly discipline, biblical theology, is the field of research that aims to find connections between the biblical texts that knit the whole Bible together. While systematic theology aims to show what the Bible teaches on any given subject, biblical theology aims to trace the meta-narrative of Scripture from Genesis to Revelation and ultimately show how it is in fact one book in the sense that it's really telling one grand story. So this field used to be laughed at in academia during the Enlightenment period by all the liberal scholars, but it's been seeing a resurgence lately with the works of Gerhardus Voss, T. Desmond Alexander, Stephen Dempster, Peter Gentry, and Stephen Wellham, to name the prominent ones. So I suspect that Bart Ehrman is specifically targeting this discipline and throwing all of their scholarship in the garbage, which is a malicious and disingenuous thing to do, especially because his audience probably doesn't even know this field of study exists. So he's purposefully keeping them in the dark and predisposing his listeners to dismissing any such arguments that might suggest that the Bible is in fact one book. But let's see if he offers any warrant to do this.
We have 66 books in the Christian Bible, 39 in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, 27 in the New Testament. So 66 books written, by different authors, to different audiences, at different times, telling different narratives, with different teachings, holding different views, presupposing different perspectives. They're often at odds with each other. They often have implausible statements in them and histories in them, and themselves are often made up of different sources, written by different authors to different audiences at different times that have been combined together into one book. You've got 66 of these books, but people treat them as a book. Because they're between two covers. That's a problem.
All right, so again, I have to wonder who is in this audience because he's saying things that anyone with a high school education on the Bible would know. All the stuff about the diverse material in the Bible, but he gets laughs about how people think it's one book because it appears between two covers. Can everyone tell that these are propaganda tactics Bart is using? He's making Christians sound foolish for believing that the Bible is one book. That's called an ad hominem attack, and whoever stoops to these depths probably has an agenda, wouldn't you say? On a scholarly level, it's dishonorable, and Bart would be laughed at if the audience were actual scholars in the field. Because to caricature your intellectual opponent's position would be academic suicide. You wouldn't do it because it would undermine your credibility as a scholar. But in front of a lay audience, Bart has no problem ridiculing evangelical Christians. It's despicable, really. Anyway, let's continue.
It looks like one book. And when you read a book, you expect it to be consistent. It doesn't occur to you that the author's going to flat out contradict himself in the next page. You don't expect it, and if you don't expect it, you don't look for it. If you don't look for it, you don't see it. Once you realize it's 66 books, oh boy, does that open up things in a huge way.
You know what's so ironic about this claim that a book can contradict itself on the next page is that Bart believes the books of the Bible have been edited and smoothed out many times over. That's kind of his whole argument as a text critic. That's the underlying presupposition of all textual studies. The goal of textual criticism is to try and reconstruct the original text and separate it from all the later additions and changes. So Bart, which is it? It sounds like you're saying the Bible redactors and editors cared about reworking certain passages to fit their purposes, but didn't care about smoothing out sections that blatantly contradicted themselves? That would seem bizarre, wouldn't it? Yeah, and I'll just exaggerate the entire Exodus story and hope no one looks for evidence, and at the same time, I'll just leave blatant contradictions on consecutive pages. Really, Bart? Is that what you think is going on? You're playing both sides of the argument here. Either the people who compiled and edited the final form of certain texts were too dumb to notice the contradictions they forgot to smooth out, or they didn't see them as contradictions at all. More on this to come.
I want to illustrate it. I'm going to start in the beginning. Genesis chapters 1 and 2. So, this last week, I was talking to one of my students in one of my classes who was an evangelical, self-professed evangelical church-going guy who was also a neuroscience major. And he wanted to know how he can take Genesis 1 literally. How is it possible? Because he's unwilling to give up the idea that it's literally true because he's an evangelical Christian, but he's also a scientist.
Okay, see, this is how I know he's talking to a lay audience. He could never get away with saying something so preposterous in front of a group of scholars. Because according to my reading, the majority of evangelical Genesis scholars, and by scholars, I'm not talking about Answers in Genesis people. I'm talking about people who've written real academic commentaries on Genesis, such as in the Baker series, the Nicot series, and my personal favorite, the Word Biblical Commentary series. If you read these and other highly respected and widely taught commentaries, you'll find that most of the authors and contributors do not take the beginning chapters of Genesis literally, not in the way Bart Ehrman is defining literally. So if Ehrman really wasn't trying to deconvert his evangelical Christian students, all he would have to say is, whoa, you don't need to read Genesis 1 literally in order to be an evangelical Christian. Just go read Gordon Wenham or Kenneth Matthews or Bruce Waltke or John Walton's commentaries. They're all evangelical scholars and they don't think Genesis 1 should be read literally. That's all he needed to say. But no, he shamefully says nothing of the sort. Next clip.
And you go through these days, one after the one, and actually the basic sequence ain't bad. You got light, okay? Think Big Bang. You get land before you get plants. You get plants before you get animals. You get animals before you get humans. Pretty good, right? Not bad. But 6 days? People say, yeah, it wasn't really days. If it wasn't really days, why does he say evening and morning the first day? Right? He's not talking about geological periods here. It's evening and morning the first day, but there are problems with that too. Because you have evenings and mornings before the sun's created. The sun's not created till the fourth day. How's that supposed to work that you have evening and morning before the first day? Before the fourth. And you have the plants created on the third day before the sun's created. What happened to photosynthesis here?
Guys, I don't know about you, but I can barely listen to him regurgitating these centuries-old arguments as if no one smart has responded to them. And you can hear his incredibly unsophisticated audience just chortling along like, oh, the Christians are so stupid. And let me be clear, I'm not advocating for young earth creationism. I know young earth creationists have their own answers to these questions, but I'm not in that camp. I'm with the evangelical scholars such as Wenham and Walton and Bill Craig who understand that the creation story is a historical event, but it's told using various literary devices found in ancient Near Eastern myths in order to define who the true God is and correct the theology of Israel's neighbors. If Bart Ehrman isn't familiar with this scholarship, then he has no business being lauded for his achievement in biblical studies. But I know for a fact he is aware of it from his debates with real Christian scholars. So the only thing to conclude is that he enjoys setting up straw men only to ninja kick them down like a 10-year-old boy. I'm sorry, but Bart Ehrman has a massive audience, and his overt attacks against Christianity must be called out for what they are. So let's get into this whole creation topic. I was going to talk about this topic on its own in another episode, but now is as good as a time as any. The word day within the story does refer to a 24-hour day. The phrase evening and morning does support that view. But this doesn't mean that the author intended to teach that God literally created all the animals and humans in one day. That's the part that makes Bart Ehrman's head hurt and a lot of Christians, but it's rather simple. Allow me to illustrate. Take, for instance, The Giving Tree by Shel Silverstein, one of my absolute favorite kids' books. The tree gives and gives, the boy takes and takes, and it's just a heart-wrenching story because it's true. Humans ravage the earth, kids turn into adults and lose their sense of joy and play, and the story is just truer than true. And within the story, the tree is a literal tree. But the literal tree is used as a metaphor. Now, it's debatable what the giving tree represents. It might be a symbol of a parent's unconditional love. It might be an allegory for God's relationship with mankind. And like I said, it could be an illustration about mankind's destruction of the earth's resources. But whichever it is, or maybe a combination of them, the point is that everyone understands that although it's a literal tree in the story, the tree is used metaphorically. And on top of this, Silverstein doesn't want his audience to think that a man can build a boat and a whole house out of one apple tree. If you were to focus on these literalistic readings, you'd be completely missing the point of the story. So now let's go back to Genesis 1. Could it be that something similar is going on in the creation story? What if God wasn't interested in giving the ancient Hebrews a scientific account of how he created the heavens and the earth? What if instead God wanted to teach his people why it's important to have a 7-day work week? What if he wanted to tell his people that the world wasn't created in a disorderly fashion like Israel's neighbors believed, but in a truly orderly fashion? What if God wanted to teach his people that humankind was created as the pinnacle of creation, not as slave labor like the Mesopotamians taught? What if God wanted to teach his people how important it was to rest from their labors and enjoy one another's fellowship with him? The creation story accomplishes all these things with literary brilliance. Even though the days are presented as normal 24-hour days, they serve as the basis for the orderly work week that God would command humans to use in order to structure their lives. But Bart probably doesn't like this explanation because he can't make fun of it. So there you go.
But what about Genesis 2? Well, it also has a sequence of creation, you can see for yourself, in which the humans are not created the last thing, they're created the first thing. The first thing God creates is Adam, before there are any plants. Wait a second. The plants and animals in Genesis 2 are created after Adam. So first of all, that doesn't work in Genesis 1. Second of all, it can't be right. But you only know that, or you're only willing to see that, or only willing to admit that, if you realize that the author of Genesis has somehow taken two different stories from two different authors, written at two different times, for two different reasons, and plucked them together. You put them together, then you get Genesis 1 and 2, and you got problems. You got problems with both of them individually, and now you got problems with the sequence. So the problem is people want to harmonize them and make them say the same thing.
Do you see now how ridiculous Bart sounds? First of all, he's practically screaming throughout most of that clip. So here's a tip. If someone has to scream their point, it's probably not a great point. They're probably playing to an audience that is impressed by screaming. I mean, isn't this what we used to say about people like Bill O'Reilly when he was on Fox News? Or what about preachers who basically yell their sermons? That's usually an indication they're putting on a show, right? So if you're a Bart Ehrman fan, ask yourself this. If Bart's argument is so good, why does he have to yell it? All right, but more importantly, this whole Genesis 1 isn't the same as Genesis 2 argument. He's presenting it as though it's the greatest discovery of biblical scholarship. That things like this prove that the Bible isn't one book, but is just multiple writings strung together that end up contradicting each other. Again, this is a terrible argument on so many levels, and you're going to have to bear with me because we'll be discussing this issue for a while. All right, first, the original audience of the Pentateuch's final form was smart enough to know that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 had differences. Those people who lived 3,000 years ago, who were the first to hear a sermon series on Genesis, knew that Genesis 1 and 2 had a different order of events. So unless you think ancient people are dumb and modern people are smart, unless you're that pretentious about the superiority of later generations, then you have to say the original audience could see the obvious differences. Then why didn't they have a problem with it? Or did they have a problem with it? That would be a sensible question to ask, right? If ancient people weren't dumb and could see the differences, were they okay with it? And if so, why? Now, Bart says people want to harmonize them and make them say the same thing. That's a quote. So I'd like to ask Bart, who are you talking about? Are you talking about the Jewish rabbis, the early church fathers, young earth creationists, or modern conservative evangelical scholars? Like, which group of people are you disparaging and presenting as fools, Bart? Because as far as I can tell, only young earth creationists are doing what you're suggesting. Let's start with the rabbis. The Midrashim demonstrate that Jewish rabbis did not read Genesis 1 and 2 literalistically. Some do harmonize the text concerning the chronology of plants and man, but the harmonization is motivated by an interest in explaining the text's theological significance, not to preserve its chronological sanctity. So let me show this in detail because I think it's really important and actually quite insightful in some cases. So we have Bereshit Rabbah, chapter 13, verses 1. And for those who don't know, Bereshit Rabbah is a rabbinic commentary on Genesis from the 5th century AD. And it's a compilation of many early rabbinic commentaries, probably dating to the time of Christ or even earlier. So it contains very old commentaries by Jewish rabbis. Now, you can read this ancient document on Sepharia.org, and the editorial team at Sepharia has added footnotes to sort of explain what the Midrash was saying. So I'll include these in italics so you can see which is which. So this is what it says about the discrepancies in the order of creation for plants and mankind. Here it says all the shrubs of the field and no vegetation, implying that nothing grew from the ground before Adam was created. But later it says the Lord God grew from the ground every tree, Genesis 2:9, referring to what happened before Adam's creation. Rabbi Hanina said, there it is referring to the Garden of Eden, and here it is referring to the development of the rest of the world. Rabbi Hia taught, but both those and those did not grow until rain fell on them. And therefore, verse 2:9, in fact, does not mean that the trees grew before Adam's creation. So, doubtless, this is a little difficult to follow, but I'll explain. This section does demonstrate that the rabbis were aware of the apparent discrepancy between Genesis 1, where plants are created on day 3 before the creation of Adam, and Genesis 2, where plants have not yet sprouted until after Adam's creation. So first, we have to recognize that there is a linguistic reason to differentiate between the plants in Genesis 1:11-12 and the ones in Genesis 2:5. In Genesis 1, 3 words are used to describe what is created. Deshe, which is vegetation, Esev, which is plants or small plants, and Eitz, which is trees. All 3 words are given in verse 11 and repeated in verse 12. But in Genesis 2, verse 5, a new word is introduced, siach, which is translated shrub or bush. So Bart would see this as evidence that the stories were written by different sources, writing at different times, for different audiences, for different purposes, and therefore no harmonization is required or even appropriate. It's similar to the whole Yahweh versus Elohim observation, right? If a text says Yahweh, that must mean it was written by the Yahwist, and if a text says Elohim, that must have been written by the Elohist. This is what people like Bart Ehrman say. But this kind of scholarship has a pre-commitment against any reasons why the text would use different words for different theological reasons. They don't acknowledge that maybe a different word is used for a different theological purpose. So we're not going to go down that whole rabbit hole today, but suffice to say, the earliest commentators saw differences and attempted to discern the reasons. So it's significant that the new word, siach, is introduced in Genesis 2:5 because that might be a clue as to what's going on here. In that quote I read from Bereshit Rabbah, Rabbi Hanina seems to be saying the reason no siach or shrubs of the field had grown yet is that these are a specific reference to plants in the Garden of Eden. But in Genesis 2:9, those plants were the same as the ones mentioned in Genesis 1. The plants in general that sprouted all over the world. So Rabbi Hanina does try to harmonize, but he does so on the basis of the linguistic differences, which is a perfectly appropriate hermeneutical move. On the other hand, Rabbi Hia had a different opinion. He says, no, nothing grew until rain fell on them all. So Rabbi Hia takes a very non-literalistic view of these passages. Even though Genesis 1 says that plants sprouted on day 3, he thinks that nothing grew until after Adam was created. So right there you have 2 views listed, and neither of them show an undue interest in preserving a pristine or literal chronology. But if you read on in Bereshit Rabbah, it says this. All of people's conversation, siach, is about the land. They say, did the land produce? Did it not produce? All of people's prayers are about the land. Lord, may the land produce. Lord, may the land flourish. All of Israel's prayers are only regarding the temple. Lord, may the temple be built. Lord, when will the temple be built? So what on earth is this talking about, you might say? Well, elsewhere in Bereshit Rabbah, siach, the word for shrub, is used as a word for prayer. And the word field elsewhere in Bereshit Rabbah is referred to as being synonymous with the temple. So I know this is getting a bit technical, but this shows an early understanding from the rabbis that the Garden of Eden was really a prototype of the tabernacle/temple. That Adam's presence and prayers are needed to produce fruit in the garden mirrors the priest's presence and prayers for the people in the tabernacle temple. This allegorical understanding of the Garden of Eden is not only well attested among scholarship throughout the ages, it seems to be given to Moses directly in the instructions for building the tabernacle. The tree of life in the garden mirrors the menorah. The angels guarding the entrance to the garden mirrors the cherubim that were woven into the tabernacle's veil and the Ark of the Covenant. The gold and onyx and precious stones mentioned in Eden are used in the priest's breastplate, the ephod. So again, I could go on about this until I'm blue in the face, but the rabbis certainly didn't care about preserving a chronological sequence of events as if this was what God was going for. Absolutely not. They searched for theological meaning embedded within the text and sometimes found some really cool things. All right, so if Bart Ehrman can't accuse the rabbis of forced harmonizations, what about the early church fathers? Well, for the sake of time, we'll just look at the most influential church father of them all. You guessed it, Augustine of Hippo. Augustine wrote exhaustively on Genesis, specifically on the question concerning its literalness. So I need to say this. Most modern readers would be absolutely shocked to hear what Augustine thought about Genesis. Stunned, even. You would think that a man writing in the 4th and 5th century would simply read Genesis as literal history and maybe talk about what it means for, the doctrine of original sin, which Augustine is also known for. But actually, Augustine has no problem whatsoever wrestling with what the text was saying apart from a literalistic interpretation. Augustine was heavily influenced by Greek philosophy, and he used his education to try and unpack what God was trying to teach us through these first chapters. So I'm going to read a lengthy portion of his work, which will do two things. It will speak to this issue of who came first, plants or animals, and it will show Augustine's Greek way of thinking that helped him understand what God might have been doing in these first two chapters. And remember, this is well before any modern science could influence him. So here we go. This is from Augustine's work titled The Literal Meaning of Genesis, Volume 1, Book 6, Chapter 10. And the chapter is called Under the Influence of the Primordial Reasons, the Crops Came Forth from the Earth, and then the Seeds from the Crops. Love that chapter title. He writes this. Nevertheless, under one aspect, these things are in the Word of God, where they are not made, but eternally existing. Under another aspect, they are in the elements of the universe, where all things destined to be were made simultaneously. Under another aspect, they are in things no longer created simultaneously, but rather separately, each in its own due time, made according to their causes, which were created simultaneously, among which was Adam, formed from the slime and animated by the breath of God, like the grass sprung from the earth. Under another aspect, they are in seeds, in which they are found again as quasi-primordial causes which derive from creatures that have come forth according to the causes which God first stored up in the world. And thus we have the crops from the earth and the seed from the crops. In all these things, being already created, received at their own proper time their manner of being and of acting, which developed into visible forms and natures from the hidden and invisible reasons which are latent in creation as causes. Thus the crops came forth on the earth, and man was made a living being, and so of the other creatures, whether plants or animals, belonging to the work of God as he works even at this time. But these beings have duplicates of themselves, as it were, carried invisibly within them by reason of the hidden power of reproduction that they possess. They have this power through their primordial causes in which they were placed in the created world when day was made. Before they came forth, in the visible shape proper to their kind. Okay, so did you catch anything of what Augustine is saying here? He's saying that God creates in different aspects and according to different causes. The first aspect in which things are created, he says, is through the word, meaning through God's spoken declaration, as it were. Elsewhere, he deliberates about how it is that God knew Jeremiah before he was born, and this speaks to the same kind of thing. Jeremiah didn't exist materially before he was born. Not even his soul had been actually created yet. But insofar as God planned to create Jeremiah or declared to create him, Jeremiah existed in this sort of pre-existent sense. And that's what Augustine thinks is going on with Genesis 1. He thinks that God's creative activity in Genesis 1 is really just the verbal declaration of what will be. And in that sense, they begin to exist long before anything materializes. The second aspect of how things exist, according to Augustine, is by way of potentiality given the initial creation of the universe. He says, quote, under another aspect, they are in the elements of the universe where all things destined to be were made simultaneously, end quote. In other words, God has already created certain things in that he brought the universe into being, and although all the elements like carbon and oxygen were floating around and combining and whatnot, they had a goal or destiny. The plan had been set in motion, and so again, there's potentiality there which renders things created even though they haven't come to fruition yet. The third aspect of existence are things that have become what they are in the material sense. He calls them things no longer created simultaneously, but rather separately, each in its own due time. And he puts Adam and grass in this category, things that emerge in their own due time. Then he talks about a fourth aspect of existence by way of seeds, that seeds arise according to their primordial causes and begin a self-propagating causal chain, as it were. And this is the same for humans. Okay, so let me read again this line, which sums up everything he said up to that point. He says, quote, in all these things, beings already created, received at their own proper time their manner of being and of acting, which developed into visible forms and natures from the hidden and invisible reasons which are latent in creation as causes. Are you hearing Augustine? This giant of the faith, the most influential and venerated church father, interpreted Genesis in a way that would make Plato, Aristotle, and Darwin very proud. He basically says, God is the efficient or ultimate cause of everything. That's in sync with Aristotle. That things can pre-exist their material form as abstract objects. That's from Plato. And that things developed into visible forms which were latent in creation. This would agree with Darwin. So what does this all add up to? Well, it sounds like Augustine believed that the 6 days of creation in Genesis 1 was about the creation of invisible forms that would later come about in the material world in their due time. And Genesis 2 gives an account of the material creation, though still Augustine doesn't press this for literality. So again, Augustine, the most eminent early church father, and there were many others, did not feel the need to harmonize these texts due to their apparent contradictions. Now, what about modern conservative evangelical scholars? Well, needless to say, this is the easy one. Almost all of them recognize that Genesis 1 and 2 have different purposes theologically. So even if they were to concede that the chapters were written from two different traditions, as some do, that would still not be a problem because the various traditions behind Genesis 1 and 2 are not trying to give a literal account of how God created the world, or plants, or humans. Gordon Wenham's commentary on Genesis is largely considered the best from an evangelical perspective. In it, he talks about the Hebrew verb bara, to create, and how it can be used in a variety of ways. But more importantly, he just acknowledges its literary genius with the pattern of 3 domains on days 1 to 3 and the 3 sets of bodies that will fill the 3 domains on days 4 to 6. He also notices the pattern of heavenly things versus earthly things. Here's a quote which illustrates his take on Genesis 1 as a literary masterpiece. He writes, "Genesis 1 is unique in the Old Testament. It invites comparison with the Psalms that praise God's work in creation, or with passages such as Proverbs 8, 22 to 31, or Job 38 that reflect on the mystery of God's creativity. It is indeed a great hymn, setting out majestically the omnipotence of the Creator, but it surpasses these other passages in the scope and comprehensiveness of vision. In that it is elevated prose, not pure poetry, it seems unlikely that it was used as a song of praise as the Psalms were. Rather, in its present form, it is a careful literary composition introducing the succeeding narratives." So you see, Wenham calls Genesis 1 elevated prose and a reflection on the mystery of God's creativity and a great hymn. Does this sound like Wenham is needing to read Genesis 1 in a literalistic way? Obviously not. And regarding the narrative in Genesis 2 and 3, he writes this: "In attempting to define the nature of the story in these chapters, discussion has focused on the processes of their composition. If earlier commentators tended to think in terms of the writer of Genesis putting into words a vision of the garden which was disclosed to him, or recording a primeval tradition for posterity, modern writers prefer to think in terms of divine inspiration working through the author's creative imagination. It is a characteristic of biblical theology to look for the cause of present calamities in the sins of former generations. It is suggested that under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, the author of these chapters identified the origin of the problems that beset all mankind: sin, death, suffering, with a primeval act of disobedience of the first human couple. Whereas a modern writer might have been happy to spell this out in abstract theological terminology, God created the world good, but man spoiled it by his disobedience, Genesis puts these truths in vivid and memorable form in an absorbing yet highly symbolic story. It is argued that such an understanding of the story's composition can account for its use of mythological motifs from neighboring peoples and its points of connection with other parts of the Old Testament, particularly the covenant and wisdom traditions. The validity of this hypothesis, like most critical suggestions, remains open to debate, but its validity or otherwise in no way impairs the inspired truth of the present narrative. So you see, Wenham regards the text as inspired truth, and yet he says these truths are told in vivid and memorable form in an absorbing yet highly symbolic story. So again, I ask you, Bart, who are you accusing of trying to harmonize these texts in order to prevent a contradictory chronology? It's not the rabbis, it's not the early church fathers, and it's not modern conservative evangelical scholars. So then it has to be young earth creationists like Ken Ham from Answers in Genesis. But I thought you were a scholar. Why would you even be interested in what those people have to say? Now, I'm sure many of your students from the South do come into UNC as young earth creationists. So why aren't you pointing them to the wealth of legitimate scholarship on this subject? It's inexcusable. All right, so Bart finishes his tirade and then he goes on to his conclusion on this subject. And remarkably, I agree with most, not everything, but most of what he says. Listen to this.
All right, well, why does it matter? If you're interested in understanding the Bible, it's important because it shows that there are things, this one example begins to show that there are problems with understanding the Bible as descriptions of things that actually happened in the past. Some of the Bible did happen. The world did come into existence. Plants did occur on the planet, and there are animals that appeared, and humans did appear. So there are things that happened, yes, but not necessarily as described in Genesis 1 and 2. In part, you can see that there are things that happened that are not actually as described simply by noting the contradictions. The point of the contradictions is not so you can go home and tell your parents that I now know the Bible's full of contradictions, so I'm not going to go to church anymore. It's not, the point is not the contradiction. The point is, if you see the contradiction, it makes you understand what this thing is that you're reading, that otherwise you think is one book. It shows that these are stories that are being told. The accounts of Genesis 1 and 2 are literary. They're not scientific treatises. They're not necessarily historical in the sense of things that really happened. They're stories that are trying to convey meaning. If you modernize them so they fit with modern science, or you harmonize them so that they fit together, you're robbing each of these stories of their own literary integrity, which means you're misinterpreting it. And if you think the Bible is valuable, then you probably should not want to misinterpret it, in my humble opinion. Implausibilities and contradictions actually help interpretation. They open up interpretation because you start seeing things you wouldn't see before, but you're not making stuff up now. You're seeing it in the text because you recognize what's going on in these texts.
All right, so he says some really insightful things in this why does it matter section. He says the point is not to notice the contradictions and say, I'm not going to church anymore. He basically says that that's not what you should do. In other words, he knows that some students of his will hear his lectures and wrongly conclude that the Bible tells lies and therefore we shouldn't believe it. So he says, no, that's not what I'm saying. Instead, he's saying that when you see these things, they prove that the stories can't be literal, and we should conclude that that's not what they're about. And he's exactly right. He's right to say that when we really examine the early Genesis narratives, we can see that there's a deep theological purpose to these stories that should inspire us to look below the literalistic surface. I absolutely agree, Bart. Well said. But I disagree when you keep saying it's not one book. It is one book with many human authors, but I haven't been shown anything that would prove that God wasn't behind the whole thing. And in a future episode, we'll discuss how biblical theology is helpful in showing the grand meta-narrative of Scripture. You won't want to miss that. Well, that's it for this week on the Good Arguments podcast. Let me know in the comments what you think, and be sure to follow or subscribe to stay up to date. Also, let me know if there's a subject you want me to cover. But that's it for now. We'll see you next time on the Good Arguments podcast.